Actually, if you all don't mind, I'll go around in a little circle, do a quick introduction. You can just talk about like where you're at in the area, what kind of space you have as far as your garden or practice, and I don't know what you want to get out of composting today. Um, all right, I think we are live now. So we're gonna, hey there, folks. We're gonna jump right into our discussion today. We'll be talking about compost and a lot of passive organic waste management, especially up here at the Foothill site. We do a lot of active composting, but whenever possible, we're doing chop and drop, compost in place, more passive styles of soil building, just because it's lower labor, less effort. So and luckily, we have a bunch of folks up here in person today, so we'll see if we get some of y'all tuning in on the interwebs. And so, sorry, we're going to do a quick introduction around the circle. You probably won't be able to hear it, but that's just how it goes, and then we're going to dive into it. So, hop over on this side.
Paul, that's one. I live on Fifth Street.
Okay.
I've been composting and gardening for 50 years.
Excellent.
But I'd like to figure out how to get my compost to work faster.
Okay. Sure. Sure.
My name's Bob Woldridge. I live in the Seawood area. We have a sandy clay soil there. Leaching this. I've been composting for about 6 years. It's pretty good results, but I'm looking for some open ideas.
Cool. Cool. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be talking about worms, and pumpkins. Pumpkins are a great one for the worm bins, and worms. I mean, the only issue with pumpkins is seed germination, but, it's not like weed seeds, easy to pull, easy to spot, so.
Made a big mistake last year. All the sugar plum, all that stuff threw into the compost pile. Pulling 50 a day in the garden after that.
Right.
Yeah. So the 9-year-old tells me, goes, guess you better not compost the seeds, huh, Grandpa?
Right. Although there's some strategies, depending on how you do it, sometimes you can pull off germination throughout the composting process, and then you're kind of recomposting the seedlings, especially with the worm bins. And Corey and I have been playing around that with the cheatgrass, because, cheatgrass seeds are notoriously difficult to sterilize or, rot out in a normal hot compost pile. So they're a challenge. But we're playing around with putting in our worm bins, getting germination, doing a little turn, and working that. So. Hey. Excellent. Love it. Love it.
I'm Misha. This is John Reed. We have been a little bit of scrap composting so that is what I'm curious about.
Gotcha.
What to do to not have air come into and ruin, or we've already broken down a lot of the trees.
Gotcha.
That's my concern.
Okay. Sure. Are you west side of Carson somewhere?
We're in Wellington.
Oh, okay.
State, whatever area.
Okay.
And we're on paper and we're not.
Yep. Gotcha. Yeah, especially this year. Gotcha. Okay. Sure. You said Hawaii? Sure. Yeah. Well, and welcome to the area, both of you. Okay. Gotcha. Purchased, or are you doing your own vermicomposting?
I'm doing my own. I've
Okay.
been worms for years now. I just changed from, I was keeping in my inventory over in my garage.
Mm-hmm.
Now I put a bucket right in my new raised bed, and I've been putting it in there, kind of.
Sure.
feeding the whole bed.
Yeah, excellent.
All the buckets inside. Hopefully they will survive the winter.
Definitely. Definitely. Is it in a bed that has soil in it?
Well, I'm trying to mount it around until I get to the next weather, and I'm trying to have a little bit of time so that I have a nice bed with my compost. Maybe I'll have some further later.
Sure.
While I'm here. I've been waiting to have it later, so it's ready for spring.
Definitely. And don't be shy about mounding insulating materials around that bucket, even if you're not going to feed them right now. That'll ensure their survival through the winter. Just, leaves, straw, wood chips, branches, pile it around and insulate them, and they'll definitely survive the winter. They slow down for certain.
And then maybe even stop eating them about now.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, or get slow. The cool thing about, overfeeding, the main issue is it can lead to overfeeding the worms, is that it'll mainly lead to bad odors and pest insects, fruit flies, things like that. When we're in the cold temperatures, it's less of an issue. So, you could still feed it and just monitor how quickly it's going down, or keep doing it in the garage, and especially I'm a big advocate of, especially at the home and small garden scale, doing vermicomposting. And particularly, there's great ways to use like a normal looking rolling trash can, normal looking round trash can, and keep one going in the garage, low or no smell all the time, it can be bear safe. And sometimes it's hard to process all of your yard waste, but it's super easy to process, 80+% of your food waste, kitchen waste,
Hi, my name's Ian. I have years of experimenting with composting like last 10 years. And staying here in Carson City, I live, need that community. So I figured out how I can best utilize all the yard waste.
Excellent. Right.
I'm Judy, and I retired in 2016 years to date, and been there for 5 years. I just had a Rubbermaid compost thing that I bought probably off Craigslist that I had in Dayton, and I was very lackadaisical about doing it with whatever, but when it came time to move, I did not want to leave all of what I got for that. And I had a friend who had a chicken feed box, and I took like 12 bags of compost with me. And I was really lazy, especially because I was looking for my chicken garden house. I tried to find like, for each stem, I just pull the stem and go, leaves, and a lot of, I thought it was but I have tons of compost. Very little energy to it. Took that with me. This house is a little over an acre, half acre. And there are 2 raised beds on the side of the house. And it's a pie-shaped lot, so the backyard is pretty big. And we took half the grass out, maybe over half of the park back. And we collected them fall and spread them over the area that got rid of the lawn. Try to build. I have rocky clay. I don't think that's in the soil pyramid. That's one, but I have very rocky soil. And the backyard is really just clay. Like, try to plant some stuff last week. Dug the thing out before it was planted. The water just basically does not affect the tree.
Right.
So, and I have lots of worms, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
But here to learn about
Mm-hmm.
So that needs to go in there, and I collected a bunch of chicken coop from a place that is really good at it. I've got a couple piles sitting in places, and I'm planning to turn that and move it into stuff. So just want to do stuff well.
Sure. Great. All right. So, excuse the little silence there, folks online. I know there's a couple of you. So, main thing, got a few folks working with worms, and it sounds like most of the issue is dealing with our climate challenges, dry weather, keeping things moist, and that's largely related to the speed of breakdown. So, speeding up the breakdown is certainly always one of the goals. Although I'll let you in on something. Some of that is directly related to labor, and it really, when we're talking about hot composting, a lot of that is in turning it, getting out and turning your pile. So sometimes the speed is directly related to the amount of labor you're going to put into the pile. But it also has a lot to do with the balance, the proper balance. One of the reasons you may be so successful and be seeing good rates of breakdown is the addition of that chicken litter. A lot of us maybe, especially if we're using mostly just green plant material, kitchen scraps, things like that, sometimes we undershoot the nitrogen that we're putting in our pile. And I think that's really common. I've had so much more success with small additions of manure. It's been challenging for me often to get a good hot pile out of just vegetation. One thing that's changed that is is going to be particle size, the size of your material. So one thing that's helped us with that is getting juice waste, the juice pulp from So Juicy here in town. That pulverized apple, pineapple. We get ginger and carrot. That stuff that really speeds up that microbial activity and gets those piles cranking. So spending that time stripping or chopping your material can definitely help. Speed up that process. Say again.
Like you said, chicken manure.
Yep.
I've heard there's some that you just stay away from.
You only stay away from them as far as going raw or uncomposted into the garden. Otherwise, all manures are compostable. Human manure being the most dangerous for us, right? Oh yeah, sorry. Dog and cat we typically do exclude. Carnivore or meat eaters is kind of the rule there. Pigs and chickens, I guess, being like the main omnivore exception. Although pig manure is pretty close to human. If you're going to be seeking out manure and going to get it, don't seek out pig. Poultry or grazing. Yeah, deer's great. If you collect it or rake that up. Some of those manures, weed seeds can be a concern, more so with the horses as they're not true ruminants. So wild horse manure can be great. You just need to worry about the weed seeds. Yep.
With the manures, though, will that send it in two different directions from acidic to basic in your composting, or will it neutralize itself?
It should neutralize when you're properly composting. You shouldn't get, salt buildup or be pushing your pH up unless you're adding. That's an issue if you're adding raw manure in the fall. That can be an accumulation. But if you're properly composting, whether it's a thermophilic or a vermicompost, no, your end product should be at a neutral or slightly acidic pH. I think you'd have to mess up your ratios to a point where I don't think it would compost well to do that. I think. Yeah. So it's going to neutralize. There's been some experiments done where worms have neutralized battery acid. And they do really amazing things as far as treating pollutants in the soil. So let's talk definitions, because we're talking about compost, and we're talking about vermicompost as well, which are a little bit different. And then there's also, you can have rotted, broken down organic materials, and it's not necessarily compost. That's important to remember. So sometimes you may see, composted manure. That's really aged manure. And so that can be much better to add to the garden, but let's not call it compost, because it's not. Your leaf pile that sits out in the backyard all season, and you get some great pockets of really nice worm castings in soil, still not really compost. That's vermicompost or worm castings, or leaf mold mulch. So compost, as we're going to talk about it, we're going to be talking about the results of a thermophilic pile, and so that means a hot composted pile. So you're putting two groups of materials together. We largely lump them into the categories of greens and browns. Your greens being your high nitrogen materials, your browns being your high carbon materials, and the funky exception is that manure counts as a green. Manure's high nitrogen, even though it's often brown. So think gross green poop when we're talking about greens and browns, as far as manure goes. When you're mixing those materials together, there's another kind of general guideline that people typically say you want 2 times the amount of high carbon materials or browns to 1 part of greens. Deeper than that, what we're looking for, and there's a range in what you want in your finished product, but we're looking for something probably between 20 to 1 and 30 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. To measure those things can be rather difficult. We always eyeball and estimate those things. Some of that eyeballing and estimation comes from some time looking at different tables. There's some great books and tables out there. The one that we've used most for reference is the Rodale Book of Composting. Got a great table in the back that goes through tons of materials and shows all of their carbon to nitrogen ratios, and so you can get a feel for that. And what this carbon to nitrogen ratio is, that's the hotness of the material. If you've heard the term, like when we're talking about the manures, you shouldn't put raw poultry manure or raw pig manure or lots of raw pig manures on the garden because it's too hot, right? It's too much nitrogen compared to the carbon. And best off the top of my head, I think like pig and human are somewhere in the neighborhood of like 6 or 8 to 1, really hot. Poultry is, I want to say, in the 10 to 12. Then the ruminant numbers are moving up to, like alpaca and rabbit manures and stuff, which are considered cool and garden ready straight out of the animal. Those are getting close to that 20 to 30 to 1 as it is. They're almost perfect as it is. Coffee grounds are another great example. They're not super acidic. That's a myth. Most of the acid is in the coffee that we brew out of it. The grounds are typically very close to neutral pH, or only slightly acidic, and they're super close to that 30 to 1 we're looking for. So you can just top dress and just mulch with coffee grounds if you'd like to. But we're going to focus on those hot piles for a little bit. So putting those materials together, the other difficulty that, we always, part of the reason we're often estimating, and it's just kind of a learning curve, is because it gets confusing with some of these materials, whether you're measuring by weight or volume. And, when you're using fluffy straw versus dense wood chips, it can be really complicated. So it's just, it takes some time playing. And how the process works is we take our materials and mix them to the best of our ability. The easiest way to do this is typically layering. So we're going to do, a layer of, say, 4 to 6 inches of our brown material, our woody materials, and then a layer of, say, 2 to 3 inches, about half that of the green materials. But you've got to pay attention to the texture of that material, how much it's going to clump. Sawdust, for example, is super, super high carbon and nitrogen. The softwoods, do I have it backwards? I can't remember if it's the softwoods or the hardwoods that are higher. But, the sawdust is extremely high compared to wood chips. Sometimes I think it's as high as, 400, 500 to 1. But it clumps. It can go anaerobic really easy. So, if you do a 3-inch layer of sawdust in your pile, when we saturate it and try to do it, that's not going to work well. So you need to pay attention. Now, shredded paper is another one, and also our leaves in the fall. Our leaves in the fall can compact and create, layers that get anaerobic You know, no oxygen. They don't allow water to permeate. So with materials like that, you're going to want to pre-mix it a little bit instead of just doing a straight layer. So, you know, I like mixing materials as much as possible. Diversity in the pile is always a win. So instead of using just leaves, go spend, you know, $10 or $11 and get a bale of straw, and, you know, mix some straw in, or, you know, seek out some wood chips. They're usually available for free. Um, Sometimes they're hard to get in small quantities for free. But we often get the big drops from arborist companies, which I love. Although the ratio, you it can be hard to tell because you've got green material mixed in, you've got leaves and needles all mixed in, right? So some.
You have to worry about the cheese with wood chips different arborists as far as other plants.
You could, and I'd say the one to be most concerned about maybe would be fire blight. So, you know, fruit trees. I think it's just apple and pears. I don't think any of our stone fruits are affected. But then,
That orange is all. I've got a roll of it now.
I'd say unless it's viral, I wouldn't be concerned. And that's why I'd say I'd be concerned about fire blight. But typically, the composting process, if we're done properly, is going to take care of those pathogens, viruses withstanding. So, and that's where tomatoes, viruses can be tricky with that sometimes. But I even chop and drop tomato stuff. I don't worry about removing it and getting it out. So, yep. And there's actually there's a third party service called Chip Drop that you can sign up for, but you have to be ready to accept it, and you have to be ready to accept the large quantity. So it's they're not super flexible, but if you need a lot and have the place for it, you can get it. So. Yeah, yep. I'll dive right into that for sure.
So that's my, so chip crop or even talking to arborists.
Yep.
You know, Joe Benigno, big guy, real close to where I am.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to ask him for his wood chips necessarily because I'm scared they go out and they're not going to differentiate a diseased tree from a non-diseased tree. I don't know how many black walnut are in this area, but
right.
Black walnut is a
yeah.
inhibitor.
Yeah.
And then the blight, and then so I'm really kind of shocked.
Yep.
And I don't know if just looking at it through a microscope, if I can tell, okay, well, there's nematodes and protozoa, it must be good.
Right.
Well, that's not necessarily true.
No, it's not. And like I said, you know, I would be potentially worried about viruses, and you don't necessarily know what you're getting. Although with Chip Drop, you can put in notes, although it would be at arborist discretion. And I put that in, you know, nothing that is, you know, significant portions of Alanthus, you know, Chinese tree of heaven, or black walnut. We don't have a ton of black walnut.
I never heard that other one. What's the other one?
Alanthus. Yeah, I think it's AILANTHUS. Yeah. And it's tree of heaven, Chinese tree of heaven. It's one that'll, you know, it spreads by rhizome. It'll pop up between sidewalk cracks, and it seeds heavily. It's also got some alleliopathic tendencies, but you know, so does sagebrush.
Yeah, and I'm wondering,
So,
like, the nature will sort of take care of itself.
I
don't want my pile to get over 160 though. I think
Correct.
It starts killing my biology.
Correct. At least not for any prolonged periods. 180 is really the marker. So once you see it above 160, like that's when you knock it down. But you know, a couple days wouldn't be an issue. But significant. Yes. Yeah. And we're gonna. Yep. And don't worry. Yep. No worries. And I'm kind of tangenting on materials with with the carbon nitrogen still, but I'm gonna get to oxygen, anaerobic, and temperatures in just a moment as well. Because no problem.
You're not too scared about asking for arborists?
I'm not. It's everything you see on the ground is what we have. The giant leaf pile, you know, those beds formed down there were cottonwood leaves that I got, I don't know, 15 yards of, mixed with arborist mulch, some random horse manure. I got some nasty weeds from the horse manure. I'm dealing with them.
Draw the line at grass clippings?
I
got all that pre-emergent.
I would, yeah. So, and that I would only do if it was untreated. That's something I would be skeptical. Yeah, no pesticides. Although I would also maybe make a distinction if I was going to be using the compost in the landscape and not in a food garden. That's also worth noting. You know, some of these things can go, you know, you go put them around the trees. There's a great book out there that dives deep on the human manure composting, you know, composting our waste. And it's, you can do it safely, but it's like, yeah, you never want to put that in a vegetable garden. You know, you put it on the maple trees, the pine trees, and yeah, it's gross, I know. So that's, you know, only if you're interested, but human manure handbook, if you ever want to check it out. So,
I did a farm once that was in China, so they were using their night soil and everything was clean, sanitary, and didn't smell.
Right. Yeah, and that term night soil comes from the Asian rice cultures that have been using human waste in the rice paddies for years, and they spread it at night because of the smell, hence the name.
Yeah,
So.
I can't say that the outhouses was great, but,
Yeah.
but actually the process of living is bad at all.
Right.
So what's the problem with the land?
It's got alleliopathic tendencies, so it can secrete things that inhibit the growth of other plants. So, but I have used it. You know, I've grown oyster mushrooms on it. It's not as bad as people say. Same with the black walnut. There's some plants that are really sensitive to that compound. A lot of plants don't care. So, yeah. Yep, and so I mean that does take a thermometer, but as far as once we build our pile, we're looking at those, you know.
Okay, now he was talking degrees. I thought he was talking inches.
No, that's 160 degrees Fahrenheit. That's our threshold for our hot piles. But so our goal with these is once we mix those our two types of materials, we get you know, have a good estimate of our carbon nitrogen ratio. We start layering or mixing our pile together. To do a thermophilic pile, for it to get hot enough at the core, and the goal of that heat, our goal is 140 to 160 degrees for 10 to 14 days over the lifetime of the pile. So that's the goal. And the reason for that is that's going to sterilize most weed seeds. I mentioned not cheatgrass, but most weed seeds. Also going to sterilize pathogens. So if you had gross manure or gross food scraps going into that pile, it's going to sterilize, not sterilize, but it's going to kill those pathogens, E. coli's, other fecal coliforms, salmonellas, things like that. Those temperatures will kill it. It's pasteurization. What we're doing is we're pasteurizing the pile, but as mentioned, we don't want to go above 180 or really too far above 160 for long periods of time, because that will sterilize the pile. And what happens when we sterilize the pile is that we destroy all our microbial life. That's what's doing the breakdown for us. That's also what's generating the heat. And then we open up this raw material, this semi-broken down material. Now it's blank real estate for new pathogens to come in. So it's just something we don't want. We don't want to sterilize. We are pasteurizing this pile. And so the way we do that is after your initial mix, size of the pile, to reach those temperatures, there are minimum dimensions. And that's why this is sometimes hard to do at home. They say 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot. So, you know, 1 cubic yard. Even that, it's kind of hard. You know, 4 or 5 feet, you know, a decent mound is really what you want for that core temperature to heat up, especially these winter months. You're going to want to monitor that, ideally with a thermometer if you're really trying to get dialed. But, you know, this time you'll see it steaming. It's almost too hot, you know, to really put your hand on. It's amazing. And all of that heat is generated by this microbial activity. It's their metabolic energy releasing heat as they're breaking it all down.
Is there a special thermometer you use to measure that?
Yep, and they call them compost thermometers, although soil thermometers will work. They're just typically not as long or as tough. You know, with that dimension of a pile, we're trying to measure the core. You want like a 24 or 36 inch stem. So, you know, it's not cheap, unfortunately. You know, it's like a $60 or $80 thermometer. Otherwise, you can get 12 or 18 inch like soil thermometers for, you know, quite a bit cheaper. But, you know, you'd have to be digging the little pockets to get it in. I've heard of people using kitchen thermometers and stuff. Again, it's just getting it into that center portion. So it has to be that size, so you have to have the space to do this. And you're going to moisten the pile to something called field capacity throughout the process. And so few challenges with this in our area. Typically the materials going in, unless they're fresh cut, they're going to be super, super dry. So they're often really hydrophobic. I've gotten into the habit of particularly with my browns, doing some pre-soaking. I'll fill a bunch of these tubs with my straw and my wood chips, anything that's really dry. Sorry, so y'all can see I have these big tubs, but I like filling my material, soaking it for 12, 24, 36 hours. Don't want to go beyond that. Anything at the point where it's going to start creating any funky smells, and those are anaerobic smells. So anaerobic means without oxygen. So once the oxygen's depleted from that water and it starts doing funky stuff, those are the smells we don't want. And a lot of the composting, you can trust your nose. Pond smells, puke smells, foul smells in general means you're probably too moist and or it needs aeration. But those two are also pretty interrelated, right? We want earthy smells. Some fermenty smells can be okay, but that's a fine line. We mostly want earthy, good soil-like smells, decaying leaf smells, things like that. If it's funky, something's probably up. Trust your nose. So we build our pile. We're moistening it that whole time. Field capacity is measured by, we call it the fist test. And it's not super scientific, but it is, it's documented. And it's basically, it should be like a moist but not saturated sponge. You squeeze the material, you should see some moisture come out, but you don't want to be free dripping. If you squeeze it and you're not seeing, really any moisture, you need a little more. And if you're dripping, then you need to let it dry out, make sure you aerate it. So to get to that point, I often find that, soaking with the hose as I'm building the pile is not sufficient unless I'm going to be coming back, every couple hours for the first 24 hours and remoistening. So I like to pre-soak a lot of my materials. Typically pulling some of it out right before building the pile, so it's a little bit of drainage. But that depends. Sometimes I'll put dry, if I know I have some dry stuff, I didn't have enough tubs to soak, I'll put dry on the bottom, knowing that that's typically going to be the most saturated part of the pile. So you're trying to get to that moisture level. We build our pile up to a sufficient size, and then we're going to be looking at temperature and remembering that those microbes they're breaking down that material, they're consuming some of that water, using it for their chemical process. They're also consuming some of that oxygen. So we made sure we didn't have any compacted layers that are certainly going to go anaerobic, but we know within a few days, 3 to 5 days, we're going to need to flip that pile and turn it to add more water, especially in our climate, and also to allow air back into the pile. So there's plenty of ways to actively aerate piles without flipping them as well. People put PVC pipe with holes in it. A really popular one now, I can't remember, Johnson Sioux bioreactor, some type of bioreactor. People are using like chicken wire or hardware cloth and making tall cylinders and then putting PVC with holes down and then filling around those. So, it's actively aerating throughout, and people are getting away with, thoroughly hot, sufficient breakdown and quick results without turning or without lots of turning. I've seen people build hexagonal tumblers out of pallets where you've got a big old wheel made out of a pallet, chicken wired on the sides, you can fill, and then you just roll one pallet length. We're just flipping piles. We do the typical 3-bin system for the most part. I do a lot of open windrows and open piles as well. Just build them up, and then we do use a special cover. We use this special compost tarps they allow it to breathe, but they hold some moisture in, and so that's what keeps it from drying out so much in our areas. But still, I find myself every couple days I'm watering the top a little bit, putting an inch on or something. No, it's not ideal. And the question was, is there any issues with city water and chlorine in these piles? And not really. It's not ideal. It would be better if it didn't have the chlorine in. But luckily, we have chlorine. Our city water is treated with chlorine and not chloramine. So chlorine, you can take like If you fill this bucket with chlorine, you could either let it sit for like 4 to 6 hours, and even without bubbling in the chlorine office, you swirl your arm in, the microbes and the stuff on your skin, it's like it's gonna neutralize it almost instantly. I don't know exactly what the ratio of skin to water is, but like I know arm's good enough for a 5-gallon bucket or something like that. So
Do you know if that's true for Douglas County too, chlorine?
I don't. I haven't looked them up, but I think they're probably chlorine too. And aside from having high mineral content and typically being kind of high pH, our water quality is pretty darn good around here. So
Coming into this, that was one of my main questions was that the last 2 years early spring I bought a baled straw, and as my grass clippings and everything that are clean go into it, I'll chop it up on my chopping block and mix that in with it. But I did notice that the last few years it slowed everything down. It's just not cooking as fast as it was before you put turning. Maybe it's the process that it's not getting the moisture, or is it just too much brown in the ratio?
could be too much brown. Are they fresh, relatively fresh clippings? You're doing them fresh as they go green?
Like the grass, I'll have 4 or 5 big bags that sits there, and then I'll chop my flakes. I like everything chopped because it's easier to turn. And I'll mix that in with it, throw it in there, and then mix. After a couple of weeks, I'll mix everything.
Right. And you think you're on point with moisture? Think you're keeping it moist enough?
I loaded it a lot more this year, and
Okay.
and watered it layers as I was turning it, where
Right.
before because it just wasn't getting down the core, but it did seem to slow things down. And whereas before I had a lot of grain.
Gotcha.
The brown, because you wait till fall for the brown, so I thought I'd get jump on it and mix it with wind.
Right.
And I noticed it did. So luckily, I almost got a whole full year before I used it the next year.
Sure.
Through the winter and everything, it just finally got in there. But through the summer and all, when it's hot, it seems to really slow it down. Because I even got covering it with moisture and some of these nuts. I don't want to. I'd like to do micro. I don't want to do them hot.
Gotcha.
I turn them.
Okay. Sure. So yeah, I'd say that's probably the easiest way to remedy that would be cutting back on the straw a little bit. And trust your nose with that. As long as it's not getting too hot or getting gross, that should increase the speed with no negative results. Assuming moisture's on point. So, the other thing that may be worth it, because you're saying straw, baled straw, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if it's that and just, the grass clippings out of the yard should have a decent amount of microbial activity just coming in, but probably not as much as some other areas. So one strategy, and this is actually, I should have mentioned this in just our building a pile. Once you get in the routine, it's great when you're layering your pile or putting it together to sprinkle a little bit of old compost, finished compost that you have from the previous batch, or from your worm bin or something. Sprinkle some of that throughout the layers. Another great amendment that you should always add a little bit of, we probably have to add less than most places, is some kind of rock dust or mineral amendment. We use a brand called Azomite, and it's just a very complex micro or mineral array. So it's micronutrients. And the reason we put that in, some of that's going to be available in raw materials, but some of the microbes use those micronutrients throughout their processes. So by having that there, we're going to assure that we have the most diverse array of microbes possible doing the work for us. Well, that's also why we're sprinkling the compost in, and then the micronutrient or the rock dust is there to make sure that they're fed at times where maybe they're not getting that nutrition from the pile, if that makes sense.
Like a starter yeast.
Exactly. Same strategy. We're inoculating the pile. We're just putting some of that or probiotics in our gut. Drinking kombucha. Same kind of thing. We're inoculating that pile with extra life at a stage where maybe it wouldn't have had as much. So, and really, it's just diversity. If you've heard me talk in some of these classes before, I always, with pollinators and pest management, you can look at companion charts and all these things, but it's really just about diversity, and that simplifies everything. So, diversity of materials, can't say enough. If you don't have any finished compost, the wild alternative would be going up a trail like this and going under some, taking a couple handfuls from a tree, in the forest, undisturbed stuff. We don't want to cause a bunch of disturbance, but taking a couple handfuls, isn't going to cause harm. And then you're bringing that life into your pile, which maybe it wouldn't have gotten there for years otherwise until a bird or some animal brought those microbes, to the area.
I've heard that before, and I just wanted to ask you, how deep do you go? I heard it called forest duff, so I usually think about taking off the pine needles, whatever's right on
Yep.
top of that. Underneath there, maybe.
Yep, basic. I mean, you can tell. You'll see it's the dark black stuff. That's right between kind of the mulch layer and then where it gets hard to dig in, or the subsoil. Depending where the forest is, that may be an inch deep. It could be 6 inches deep. But yeah, some of that stuff it'll be microbially rich. And I've mentioned a couple times the Korean natural farming preparations and stuff. I didn't really get around to doing them this year, but that's one of their primary methodologies. Is they'll go out and collect IMO, indigenous microorganisms, and they use white rice in wooden boxes buried for a few days in a location like I just described to collect a culture, and then that culture is made shelf stable with sugar through like a liquid extraction, and then a super saturation with sugar, and then it's fridge stable and it's used for other methods along the way. So that's IMO from Korean natural farming. If anybody wants to go down that wormhole, there's a whole bunch of cool stuff with that. So let's jump into vermicompost, and then we'll talk about some of the chop and drop and passive stuff. Any other questions about hot compost before I kind of transition? Sure. And that's actually kind of related to what you're talking about. Part of what might have slowed it down, and again, one of the challenges with doing the thermophilic piles at home and getting that quantity of materials, is that ideally we're making these piles with mostly fresh materials. But to get that quantity, we usually have to store it, right? And doing it layer by layer, little by little, whether in a pile or in a tumbler, we're typically not going to get that heat because we're not doing it all at once and we don't have that mass to start with. And it's like, once a pile is halfway through, it's hard to just like add some materials and get it to heat back up because it's in a different stage of the process. It's really those raw materials in bulk with that mass that create the heat. So grass clippings can though. Grass clippings can be good though. You got to be careful with them sometimes. But so yeah, that can be a challenge, and that's something that would be. It would be sometimes it's hard for me to call tumbler stuff compost. It's great for the garden still. It's a great material. It's just a different type of compost or a different material. So, do you have a lot of worms in your tumbler? Yes, that's a great idea. Oh, they did. They ended up freezing. Okay, gotcha. And see, my mom's down in Gardnerville, and I think worms survive in her tumbler over the winter, although she goes relatively full. But she basically has her tumbler working like a vermicompost. And I've explained that to her because she's gotten frustrated with trying to get it hot. And I've explained the same thing. It says, you're not unless you make the big pile. And that's okay because she's not putting noxious weeds and, stuff that has seeds. It's mostly, garden stuff that, she's okay with the volunteers. She hasn't gone too crazy with the pumpkins yet. So that's one of the main reasons I like the worm bins for vermicomposting, is because you can add small amounts at a time. There's never really a turning process. The only thing you'll ever do, depending on what style you have, is maybe go move a bin from top to bottom. Typically we do either tiered bins, where you've got a bin at the bottom the worms can move through, and they sell these too. They call them worm towers or worm hotels. But I built them with these orange tubs, just orange tub inside an orange tub, cut the bottom out of one, and put some little slats across to hold the other one in place. And then those are called flow through bins. And that's also what I like to do in the large, which I'll roll out before we break away the one I have in the hoop house that I just put worms in. It's not super active yet, but I've got an normal rolling trash can, same style. Hole cut in the bottom so that I can remove the castings. Thank y'all, have a good one. And then I've got, I think, 1/2 inch PVC, 6 of those going across, and you feed the top, And then as the worms do their job, the castings come out the bottom, and you just pull the castings from them. You can scrape or turn the PVC if you need to harvest, if you don't have enough at the bottom. And then there's never any lifting or moving. And, you could have that, this is something we're thinking about modeling for some of the restaurants and places that are interested in recycling their green waste, and rather than transporting it and us doing it and then selling the compost or doing that whole circle, what if they internalize it and use it in their landscaping, use it in their food gardens, whatever the case is? Because one thing I haven't mentioned yet as well is both of these types of composting, you've got 40 to 60% mass reduction that goes on in the material. And a lot of that, in the worms, that's stored up in the biomass with the thermophilic piles. That's biomass of microorganisms, other thing. I don't even know, but you get a 40 to 60% mass reduction. What you start with, you end up with 40 to 60% of that weight in finished compost, which is remarkable in and of itself. So something to be said there. And the conditions for worms, we talked about the freezing. So they are temperature sensitive. Depending on the size of your bin, you can get a decent amount of insulation. A common way that people build outdoor ones is just with cinder block. And so those ones are kind of, I don't know what they call them, but they're more similar to the bin swapping method. But typically what's done is you make a rectangular frame out of cinder blocks and put some kind of passive, some kind of divider that the worms can go through, but it's going to hold your material. So, chicken wire or some kind of plastic mesh, and make a couple compartments so that you can be feeding one, and then you start feeding another, and then you start feeding the next. And by the time you're 1 or 2 compartments away, the first one is finished, and most of the worms have migrated to the new food source. So then you can harvest from that side, knowing most of your worm population is in the other side. There's some other strategies for separating the worms out if you're taking a bunch of castings but don't want to take too many worms out, because whenever you're harvesting the casting, you're going to have plenty of cocoons, plenty of baby worms that you miss. So typically it's best to keep your population in your bin, and their populations do self-regulate, so you don't have to worry about it. They self-regulate based on food and temperatures and all that stuff. But they're easy. You can harvest all those castings. If you have a bunch of worms you want to return to your bin, they don't like sunlight, they don't like heat, they don't like dry. So you can, it's simple doing it by hand. You make a pile, you brush off the top, the worms go down, you brush off the top, the worms go down, you brush off the top. Once you get to the bottom ½ inch, it's like all worms, no castings. And you've got, if you're doing a bunch, yeah, it's going to be a pain in the butt, and you probably don't even worry about it. You make sure your migration's working. In the flow-through bins, a very small amount of worms end up dropping and falling through because they don't want to, because they're going to have to go through, that dry space to the bottom of the bin. I do keep the bottom a little moist, so then, the castings, there's a living population in there. So, but once you get the population going, it's hard to knock it back too much unless you really take them all out intentionally. So, the main, or I guess yep. Okay, so best kind of worms. Let's see. Genus species, they're called red wrigglers or just composting worms. I think it's Eisena fetida or Eisena fetida, EISENA FETIDA or something like that. And they're considered composting worms. They're not night crawlers. The main distinction between them and other big earthworms or night crawlers is that they move horizontally in the organic matter or mulch horizon, that they like the topsoil area. They don't really go into the subsoil horizons at all. Night crawlers and earthworms are typically the opposite. They'll often go as deep as 10, 12 feet down into the subsoil horizons, and they come up, and they're the one, they have real burrows, and they'll drag. You can see videos of them like dragging leaves down into their burrows, and they're dragging them down that deep into the soil, bringing that organic matter down lower into the lower layers. So that's the primary distinction. When you do like piles outside in ground, typically when they're finished, you'll see night crawlers at the bottom layer, and then you'll have these red wrigglers, the composting worms, all throughout the pile, wherever it's moist enough. And typically not on the outside layers. So, the only real downsides of vermicomposting is that there isn't a method for sterilizing weed seeds or pathogens. Saying they don't sterilize pathogens is kind of a stretch. There's no active pasteurization, but the biology certainly cleans up materials. My first experience with vermicomposting was at relatively large scale. I don't remember exactly. I don't know. It was 140 or 180 square feet of worm beds, only a couple feet deep. But we were processing only cow manure, nothing else. So typically, with your worms, you're going to want to feed them another mix of greens and browns. Worms will take closer to 50-50, closer to 1-to-1. They're a great one and so one of my favorite things, and if your strategy is to process your kitchen waste with your worms, which is more appropriate, you can scale it up and do yard waste too. But for kitchen waste, we often don't have a good source of browns coming out of the kitchen. So shredded paper is the ticket for me. That office paper shredder, shred it up, and that's what we do. My folks do a worm bin at home. That's my home one. It's pretty much. Although I also I should mention for the home garden, and I trust them to get rid of some pathogens. My home worms also get. We have a separate trash can in the bathroom, so Q-tips, snotty tissues, toilet paper rolls, paper towels, all that stuff. Everything out of the vacuum, everything I sweep up off the floor, dog hair, dryer lint, all of that stuff goes in the worm bin at home. So wouldn't use that for the work garden up here, because we're donating, or that wouldn't be appropriate for anything like commercial or something like that. But for the home garden, absolutely. And yeah, so that's the primary brown source for them, and then they get all their kitchen waste. And the coffee grounds, kind of, I don't know if they count as either. They're kind of like bedding and food, but they're a great addition there as well. So, yeah, I mean that's the only downside. But yeah, no active.
You mentioned soaking the grounds. Worms seem to love cardboard, soaked cardboard.
Yep.
For whatever reason. Clear it up a little bit.
Yep, absolutely, and that's our paper shredder at home will take normal. So I shred a lot of the cardboard too. So and there is and that does I don't know the answer to I don't use shiny paper magazine paper. And I know newspaper nowadays, 70 or 80+% of newspaper ink is soy based. Other stuff, yeah, shiny color stuff I don't put in just because it doesn't seem right. But I'm generally not super concerned, and I know that the dryer lint and stuff off the floor, I know that there's microplastics going into my garden via that, and I don't know the health answer, but from a sustainability perspective, I feel really good about taking control of that on my own and putting it into my own garden. And I don't think, because it's such a small ratio, I have a feeling that the health, negative potential negative effects to my health are probably minimal. So I feel really good about doing that stuff and not putting it in the landfill. So
shiny stuff seems nasty in the compost. It doesn't seem right.
It does, and I have tried that. I've done that in worm bins, and I've done cotton and blended underwears and stuff in worm bins before. And then I've done glossy wrapping paper and stuff, and it almost never. It lasts so long that I don't know if it actually gets broken down or if it's another micro situation. That's one of the issues with some of the marketing of biodegradable plastics and whatnot. Sometimes they're not actually degrading; they're just breaking into micros really quick, and then that's that pollution's just out there. We don't really know what the effects of that are going to be yet. That's we're going to find out.
One of the exciting things I had last year was that I've got 2 4x plywoods into a wedge, and it's open, and then I just mix into that. That way I use pitchfork and tumble and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
With the sink waste and stuff, I dig down into it, keep vermin and the animals would dig down and bury these piles into it, and then would go without mixing stuff maybe 6 weeks ago. When I did mix, though, I found the worms just, I mean, they were just big bunches. I mean,
Right,
they were feeding off that. So I was really excited and all when I finally got to this spring. Like last spring, they're all there. This spring, I went to it, my worms went away. I don't know what happened over the winter, if they froze, what, but I had maybe 5% of the worms. I was so excited that there was so much in there. They were the smaller,
Right. Now, was the stuff that they were chowing on when you saw the massive quantities, was that pretty much broken down and gone by that point?
It still has some odor.
Okay, gotcha. And now, is this like, where is it located? Is it on, is it touching native soil? Is it touching your yard?
Yes, it's,
Gotcha, so they're free to migrate in and out. So they could have just finished their job and moved on to other stuff, especially as it was warming, warming up other places, And so,
like me?
right, well, and so that brings me to the next point that you were mentioning the worm towers. So, and doing the worm towers. So that's a great strategy where you can use, wide diameter PVC, small buckets, even 5-gallon buckets, and actually have them in garden or yard space, buried in with some holes in the sides, and then you feed that bucket or that tube your materials. You can put that paper waste in there, stuff the banana peels in there, all that, and have it right in the garden. And they're going to be, moving. Great strategy for raised beds, having a few worm towers throughout. If you have an old blender, like I said, particle size, it's just the same for worms. All of this is going to be processed faster. It's all going to break down faster the smaller the particle size is. So worm smoothies, old blender that you never use for, actual consumption, and put all that gross stuff in there and make a smoothie for the worms. And then I don't even wet my paper or cardboard. I just spread that out and pour, the smoothie over the top. But typically I don't spend the time doing that because the worms do a good enough job. I don't shred the toilet paper tubes. I just do it chunky, and I'm not in a rush. If I was trying to do it faster, that would be certainly the first things I do. And sorry, I didn't check in on comments on here. It looks like nobody's saying anything. So you guys, we're almost wrapping up. Feel free to chime in if y'all have any comments or questions in the interwebs. So, yep, the egg cartons are great as well. Although, there's some value in using those as your own transplant containers as well. They can hold up all right, and I'd only use it for green stuff, nothing that's got real root system because they're so shallow. But, use them like your little plug trays, just for that first germination through the first week or two. And then plant them straight in the ground like those little Jiffy pots. And so a couple other, the other couple downsides to the vermicompost compared to a thermophilic pile is there's a couple material limitations. Both of them should pretty much only be getting, with the exception of manure, should only be getting things that used to be plants. No animal products. No dairy, no meat, no oils or super greasy stuff. So that's the kitchen waste that really is not appropriate for these systems, is if it's cooked and it's got, grease and oil in it.
Eggshells.
Eggshells are just, that's good call. That is the one exception. Manure and eggshells are the one. Yep, 100%. And yeah, the more you crush them up, the better. Eggshells are one of the things that, even a great pile that gets real hot, you can still see some eggshell fragment on the way out. Another Korean natural farming preparation that may be worth looking into as well, though, it's water-soluble calcium, and it's made using brown rice vinegar and eggshells, and you get a liquid extract. You char the eggshells first in the oven. You should have the membrane removed. Char them, crush them up, and then you do an extract. It bubbles out all crazy, and that extracts, and then you dilute that. And the brown rice vinegar is used in all of these preparations to be applied to the plants, and that's a homemade calcium fertilizer. So, which we all know, that's what we always hear about with our blossom end rot for our tomatoes, right? Calcium. Although often it's pH. So that's a whole other discussion we'll get into, though. So. Yeah, I'm hoping to actually set aside the time and get some of those preparations made this season. So I did put out a request. I've got a couple people interested in helping out in making some of the preparations. So I'm not trying to do all of them. So if anyone wants to go down that Korean natural farming wormhole with me, make sure to give me a shout out and let me know, and we can collab on some of that stuff. So, all right, great. Glad to hear it, Charlotte. We got a lurker on there. So, the last thing I will mention, although I don't know if it's appropriate for anybody here, it sounds like everybody's doing outdoor stuff. There's a type of fermented composting that's suitable for indoors. Apartments under the sink, laundry room. Yep, Okashi, you know what I'm talking about. And so it's, again, a Southeast Asian microbial preparation. It's something you would purchase, the bokashi inoculant, which is the microbial inoculant, although there is a farmer in Northern California that makes a proprietary one, so it's relatively local. And that, it's an anaerobic fermentation, so it's no oxygen. It's done in closed containers, closed buckets, which is part of what makes it great for under sink. I'm fairly certain you can do almost no brown material. It can be almost all kitchen waste and scraps. And what you do is you layer it in the bucket, and then you add a carbohydrate source along with the inoculum. So typically it's like some kind of rice flour. I think almost any kind of flour will work though. Any kind of starch flour. I don't know how widely different types have been experimented with. I think brown rice flour is most typically used. And then you layer that in. Once it's full, I think it's a 2-week anaerobic fermentation before it's ready to go in the garden or into the soil. However, after it's been put in the garden, it does require another 2 weeks before it's safe for plant roots. It needs a little bit of soil curing because it's going from that anaerobic state. And I haven't done that. I haven't messed around with bokashi. The alternative to bokashi that I did for the sake of being able to process meat and dairy is more similar to vermicomposting, but probably less appropriate for indoors, and it's black soldier fly larvae. So they are just what they sound like. It's a fancy name for a maggot bin, but it's very similar to a worm bin, and it's with this specific species of fly that is pretty cosmopolitan up to a certain, I think their native range is upwards of, Utah, Colorado, maybe even New York, all the way down to the other side and throughout the tropics. They're worldwide. We have them here. While they look a bit more like wasps than flies, although they're all black. But a couple cool things about them that kind of brings down the initial gross factor at the idea of a maggot bin is that they secrete a special pheromone that doesn't smell particularly unpleasant. It's kind of weird, but it repels common houseflies, common filth flies. So it actually prevents them from coming and getting into the food source, helps repel. They don't have mouth parts in the adult phase. They just live for a couple weeks for the sole sake of reproducing, utilizing all the energy that they stored up while they were maggots. So that means two things. That's related to why the maggots are such voracious eaters. So they're really, really good, hungry composters. But that means they're not a disease vector because they're not out feeding on carrion and poop and things like that. So there's no disease vector. And I think, what is it? It's based on surface area, but an inch or two thick, a 1 square meter, so 3 foot by 3 foot bin can consume 22 pounds of food waste in a 24-hour period, 10 kilos in 24 hours. And because they're maggots, they can process, old pizza, gross leftovers, lasagna, moldy cheese, a carcass. We used them on farm in Virginia. We processed all of the blood and all of the unusable carcass parts, the stomach bits and whatnot, processed it all through the black soldier flies. So the other cool thing, once they're ready to pupate and turn into flies, they change color and then they leave the bin. So you put ramps in the bin and they crawl out and you can hang a bucket and they'll harvest themselves. Harvest themselves for what? Well, guess what? Chickens love them. So do fish. You always have, yeah, you need to do a couple, so you'd always have to chuck a couple and let them go, but you don't need many. You know, they leave eggs, and it's like the, you know, one of their favorite, easiest things to get them to lay eggs in the bin, because you can collect them naturally. I ordered them when I was in Truckee, because I couldn't get a wild collection. I was able to get a wild collection in Virginia, just using fermented chicken feed outside, and you just kind of wait, and then, you get a bunch of maggots in there, but then at a point they ended up winning. And I can't remember, there was a couple steps to make sure that they were going to win and populate, but then the other ones dispersed and I got that collection. But they like laying their eggs in corrugated cardboard. So you can just keep that around. Whenever you harvest, you chuck a couple in the dirt so that they're going to pupate and the bin will keep going. Again, just like worms, you know, they won't do outdoors in the winter without special considerations. But they're pretty darn cool. So reptiles, they're good reptile food too. Most appropriate for feeding to poultry though. Oh, fish as well. So I think that's, oh cool, we've got somebody watching from Louisiana today. Hi Julie, that's kind of rad. And yeah, Linda, as soon as I end this, or within a minute or two, it'll actually be posted on our page. It should be on the front page, and it'll also be under the videos section. So if you go along the tabs where it says photos, posts, there's one that says videos, and all of the classes are on there as well. So I think I didn't get much into chop and drop passive composting, the passive soil building stuff, or the cool composting. The main thing is that it's slightly lower quality technically than doing like a hot pile or vermicompost, but it's still great. And that's, you know, the least amount of work. You know, chop and drop, put it in place, put some mulch over that. That's what I do wherever I can. You know, I've got sections where we grow clover, and I grow it just for the sake of using it as like a green mulch kind of chop and drop fertilizer. So that's one of my strategies for keeping roly-polies from eating my strawberries, actually. Isopods go after the strawberries if and only if they don't have moist green stuff to eat. If I keep them fed with moist green stuff on the ground, they don't touch the fruits. Yeah, I think that's about all I got, unless anybody has any questions for me.
You said the cold composting is not as active or strong as the thermal. Is that because it hasn't broken down enough for the plants to seem to?
You know, I think it's a combination of that it breaks down slower, and I think more will get released to the atmosphere. I think it's also that it's at some point it's gonna break. Yeah, I think it's not all getting broken down to those constituents as completely or uniformly. So it's less plant available stuff, and it's certainly going to be less microbially active. And what we're learning more and more is that microbial diversity as one of the primary factors related to plant health. Some of the cool studies that are coming out about that is that we're learning that and of course it's because there's money behind cannabis, is that we're learning that terpene and cannabinoid diversity is directly related to specific soil bacteria and diversity of soil microbes. And I'm certain that that's the same with flavor profiles and different compounds in fruits and vegetables as well. Just no money to study that, right? And I don't have a great answer for why it's, you know, technically lower quality. That's the best I got, but right. Although I'm almost certain some of that is, you know, harvest and shipping practices.
Well, they breed them to ship
Mm-hmm.
for thicker skin,
Yep.
more spoil.
Yep, and they're harvesting them early, you know, because they have to ship and process. Absolutely on the pet hair, human hair as well. If you do haircuts at home, absolutely. And it's, you know, sometimes slow to break down, but hair, feathers, toenails, all that stuff, it's slow, but it's considered a nitrogen source. You know, feather meal is a nitrogen compost. So, oh heck yeah, that would even be more appropriate, I'd say, for a hot compost pile. But yeah, I like it in the worm bin as well. Hey, thanks, Charles. Thanks, everybody. So I'm gonna close this on out. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and yeah, know that we're gonna be continuing to do these live, weather permitting, and stay tuned for we'll have updates. We may change our time, some of our times and days for next season, but we may be requesting some feedback on that as well. Although Facebook's not letting us do polls, so we'll probably do it via email. Make sure to visit our website and get signed up for our newsletter if you're not already, because we're going to be looking at weekends, evenings, and talking about maybe different times. So thanks everybody, and let me just